Hi, everyone. Good evening. Nice to see faces online here, and I want to welcome you to this session that Rabbi Aviva and I will be conducting this evening, largely in response to questions that were submitted in advance at this unusual time. And the way we'll handle further live interaction here is you're welcome to chat in a running way in the side window here with things that are on your mind and that you might like us to address. We'll see how much of that we can get to. We hopefully will be able to cover a lot of what's on people's minds from the tremendous intake of questions that we got. We'll see. Maybe we'll need to do another one of these sessions if we get overwhelmed with material. I'm going to start with just a few sort of introductory and framing pieces here, and then we're going to jump in on a number of topics. So I want to really emphasize a few things here in terms of what you shouldn't expect from this next hour that we'll spend together. First thing is that on many of the issues we'll discuss, we actually can't really, and it seems somewhat unwise to give definitive psak, definitive rulings on any number of things. The whole situation we're in is a shat hadachak. It's a pressing circumstance as such is sort of not paradigmatic in all kinds of ways. It's rapidly evolving. It's hard to foresee all the consequences of what temporary moves in a given moment may mean for the contours of Jewish life. And that means that a certain degree of caution is just advisable and required. It feels to us like in some ways the most responsible thing to do in sessions like this is to share information that we have, to offer models grappling with here and there to weigh in with some strong instinct and rabbinic opinion. But with the understanding that people are going to make different choices here no matter what we say. Something I think that's important to take in to get a sense of where we're coming from writ large. We're not seeing this as a moment for momentous reevaluation of entire systems of doing things, unless we would have felt that way absent this. It doesn't feel to us like we are yet living in a moment that is analogous to Churban Habayit, the destruction of the temple, where the whole deck is being reshuffled in terms of all kinds of halachot. It feels much more analogous to the Bitul HaTamid, the temporary discontinuation of the daily offering in the temple that happened during the period of the Hashmonaim and the Maccabean era. That's a real crisis, a real issue to respond to, and also fundamentally a feeling that we will get back to something we recognize at least as more similar to normal, even if the world changes as a result of this, and we'll see. So we feel this is a moment for clear-headed thinking, for both amplified deployment of leniencies in the face of, and other considerations that would otherwise be operative in a limited way, while also training ourselves to be resilient for a difficult period of time where things will not work the way they are supposed to all the time. We're not going to get to everything, but we do hope to address some major issues you raised. On some matters, you will hear us offering some clear guidance. In others, you'll see us thinking aloud with each other. And perhaps the most important, and Rabbi Aviva will have more to say about this in a minute, the discourse of halacha that we really believe in and will be modeling here is one that seeks integration of all the values that are driving us into one unified approach. It's not a discourse of halacha trading off against safety, halacha against family, halacha against health. Instead, it's our halacha questions are bringing us to what's hard and how to navigate and balance all of that in a difficult time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Aviva to get us started on one of our first topics, which is going to be about virtual minyanim and the role of Zoom and ritual, etc.
Great, thank you. And just before jumping into that specific topic, I wanted to say one word of framing as well in terms of this not being a format where we're going to just go ahead and lay down a specific psak, which is not what we usually do in any case. But I do think this moment is a different moment than a lot of other moments we face, where while we do in part want to lay out information, sources that can help people navigate their own individual choices, there's also an added piece of this, which is that in a moment of pandemic, actually the kind of messaging of what a larger public or community will do really matters. So I think some of this is, to speak from a more meta perspective for a second, is some of the questions that we're going to address might be more of, you have to weigh what you need in this moment, in this particular Shad Hadachak, and navigate your own path. And some of this is really more about confronting the effects of choices that you might make as an individual on other people, and as sort of religious leadership, taking responsibility for larger communal action. So we're going to start with the question of virtual minyan on Zoom. There's been a whole lot flying around this question. And I would say, as a sort of opening to this, the question is not, well, what's sort of the formal halachic requirements around this, and to what extent does that pose an obstacle to the obvious better thing to do, which is to continue to gather in whatever community and capacity we're able to do. And what I think we'd like to do by talking about some of these sources is really to ask, what is it that we're trying to do when we do minyan, and how do we balance our need for tefillah and what is part of what it means to do tefillah with what we're trying to do on a communal level. And in that way, I think minyan in reality can be a lot of things. Often for people, it's a way to start the morning and to see other people, and has a social component. And some of what happens when you start looking at halacha in a Shad Hadachak moment is it actually allows you to be clearer around various issues at play, to sort of disentangle different parts of one particular practice. So when we think about virtual minyan, there are two main issues, right? One is, can somebody who is on virtual space on Zoom say something like a bracha and actually be motzi, right? Actually fulfill the obligation of somebody who is listening, as such that they can say amen and have their obligation fulfilled. That's one question. And there's another question, which is, can you actually constitute a minyan through virtual space if there is not a physical minyan gathered anywhere? So that first question about being yotzer, about fulfilling your obligation, is a question even if there is a minyan somewhere, but you personally can't access it, right? This comes up a lot if somebody is sick, or perhaps lives in a remote location. That's a question that has existed for a while now. And two of the main issues in thinking about whether you can fulfill your obligation come from early sources that we have. One is the image of this synagogue in Alexandria that was so big in Egypt in the times of the early rabbis that if you were sitting in the back row, you couldn't hear what the chazan was saying. So they had this practice of waving flags, and you would know when to say amen by when the flag was raised, even though you couldn't hear. So that's an example of seeing, but not hearing. And then we also have the example of the shofar, where the core source in the Mishnah is about how you can't be yotze if you hear havara, just the echo, instead of the sound itself. So this plays out in a whole lot of ways, and I just want to sort of cite two more recent tshuvot on this. Though when it comes to technology, recent isn't necessarily as good as contemporary in the exact moment. Technology has changed so much over time. But there are a number of different modern approaches to this when it comes to questions of being able to, for example, hear Havdalah over the phone if somebody is in a hospital. Right, what about a microphone? That's a particularly charged question. So what we see that I want to kind of highlight in this moment is one of the voices that's most adamant against the idea of fulfilling your obligation through the phone is the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg in Israel, is sort of really against the idea of fulfilling your obligation through hearing somebody over the phone. And a couple of things he raises are the question of kavana, right? Can you actually fully have kavana in tefillah? But he talks about how the posture of prayer is sheifanet milibo mikol machshavot, or you have to sort of get rid of all other things on your mind when you're in that moment of tefillah. And how can you possibly do that if you are trying to deal with technology? And I think, right, to some extent, you think of our present moment, in some ways people are so used to being around technology, maybe that's not really an issue anymore, or maybe our technology is so smooth that that's not an issue. But I think we all know that when you have a Zoom call that starts at 8 p.m., it's not actually going to start until 8:05 p.m. because everybody's going to be fiddling with their technology in all sorts of ways, and people will fade out and need to adjust. So I think that's one question when we're thinking about tefillah and virtual minyan. We want to make sure we don't lose the tefillah part of tefillah b'tzibur if our technology is going to get in the way of that. And the other thing that I think is really fascinating and requires some attention and thought, and I don't think is an obvious, it's kind of an obvious answer, is he talks about whether hearing somebody's voice through a microphone or a telephone is derech shmiya rov b'nei adam. Is that the way that most people hear each other, right? And that it has to be the way most people hear each other, right? The general way of hearing voices and people expressing themselves for it to count as a way to fulfill your obligation to hear somebody else say words of tefillah. So I think what's so interesting about this moment is, in some ways, I think people are jumping to, well, yeah, maybe this is going to become derech shmiya. And it's actually going to be the most usual way to interact with people. And I think part of what we were saying in that opening frame of, we're not quite at Chorban Habayit yet. It's not quite the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, a totally new era. I would say at this moment, for many of us, actually hearing somebody talk through Zoom, it doesn't feel quite normal if these are people we're used to being around in person. And I know when you try to Skype with your children when you're on a trip, I remember very distinctly the first time I was away on a trip and my eldest was looking at me on my husband's phone. And he said, I can see Ima, but I want to touch you. I want to touch you and I can't touch you. And sometimes this interface actually makes us more aware of distance. So I think at this moment in time, it's an acute moment. It is a moment where maybe for, the past week, most of our interactions and conversations with people have been through Zoom and computer, and it's becoming the way we're doing our majority conversation right now. But I think it would be a leap to say that that is the new normal. And it's okay to be in a space for a little while that feels strange, and to sort of sit with the fact that actually right now this isn't normal and there's something that's lost in that non-normalcy. So a lot more we could say there, but I think I wanted to highlight those two pieces of why it's hard to make the leap to virtual tefillah, even though there are obviously quite a lot of benefits. I'm going to turn it over.
Aviva, if I can just push you on that. So where do you sort of come out then, given that reflection on the actual being yotzei bracha question, if someone just, that's their way of doing it?
Right. So I think, certainly in times of Moshe, Feinstein says this about Havdalah in the hospital. If that's the only way that you can hear a bracha, he talks about Havdalah there, then that is certainly the way to do it. But I think the question is, when a lot of people are talking now about minyan, we really have to get to part two, which is about whether you can even constitute a minyan, to talk about responding to responding to Kaddish or something like that. So let me ask you, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I feel like I'm still sorting out my exact position on this one. For folks who have been following this, Rav Eliezer Melamed has kind of broken the dam on this for many people. One of the main poskim in Israel in the Dati Leumi community, and he came out with, I don't know, it's been touted as a psak, though I haven't seen a reason basis for it beyond a general report of the contours of an oral conversation. But where he essentially came out and sort of hedged and said, yeah, you can make a minyan over Zoom for anything that there's no risk of a bracha levatala, which I think was in a certain way is a nice way of getting at this. So what did he mean? He said you could say Kaddish, you could say Baruch Hu over Zoom, but you couldn't repeat the Amida, and you couldn't do anything basically that really took God's name in a full bracha for him. I thought it was interesting he put Baruch Hu in with Kaddish. I'm not sure that would have been my instinct, but I think he's trying to do two things there. One is to recognize that it's a little bit mukhra, it's a little bit balanced on an edge here. You could go one way or the other, and I want to say something about that in a minute. But also trying to do something which we all would do well to think about, which is, how can we respond to the need of the moment without unwittingly paving a road that we don't want to walk down in the future? And I think Rav Melamed there has sort of constructed the ability for people who are feeling stranded to say Kaddish and not completely cut them off from that, while at the same time not allowing anything anyone would recognize as a full davening on Zoom, such that when the conditions go back to normal, people will obviously flock back to that earlier form. I guess I would just say in the most basic of terms, so people have a sense of what's behind the curtain on this one. Broadly, you could speak about there being two archetypes that the Gemara talks about with this. There's a Mishnah Pesachim that talks about the Korban Pesach has to be eaten in one house, and that you are not allowed to take the meat outside, and that gets extended to you're not allowed to take the meat outside of Jerusalem when you're eating it later on. And the rule there is mina agaf velachutz kelachutz, mina agaf lifnim kelifnim. The threshold of the doorway is basically the barrier for whether you've crossed over or not. And Rav in the Talmud says v'chein letfilah, which seems to be a statement that means if you want to have a minyan for davening, you've got to all be in one physical space, beginning and end of story. And then you've got this other statement of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi who says, "Afilu mechitza shel barzel eina mafseket ben Yisrael avihem shebashamayim." Even the tallest iron wall can't separate between Israel and their heavenly parent, which, if you take it as a full archetype, means God knows where to find you, right? So if you extend that to Zoom, it's sort of like in the Rav archetype, there's no possible way that a Zoom minion can count for anything. In a Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi archetype, it would be like, what? God can't find you on the opposite sides of that screen. But the actual sort of playing out of this is much more complicated and really gets to whether certain texts that seem quite lenient around zimun, around gathering together in groups for benching, can in fact be translated to areas of tefillah. So there's one Mishnah and then a Gemara on it that says if you have two chavurot, two groups that don't even see each other, certainly if they see each other, but even if they don't see each other, but they have a common server, like a common waiter who's taking care of them, they can join together in one group for zimun. And that gets developed even further to say, yeah, two groups that have come together for a wedding and everyone knows they're there for the wedding, even if they don't see each other, they can sort of orally, join together from adjacent rooms. And even in two structures. So that's clearly out there as a ruling. The thing that is much less clear is, number one, does that mean that even groups can be formed that way, as opposed to groups being added together? In other words, it's one thing to have a group of three and a group of three become a group of six. It's another thing to have 3 people in 3 separate rooms with a waiter serving all of them and say that those people can do a voice by distance zimun. That's not so obvious at all. That's the Ramban versus the Rashbash there. And then there's the question of whether this even applies to tefillah at all. Should you be able to talk that way about a minyan as opposed to perhaps the more relaxed rules of just saying a joint birkat hamazon? There are these cases that talk about a person who is mar'eh panim, somehow shows his face through an upper story window behind the Beit Knesset, and counting that person towards a minyan. But sort of seems like that case is where the person is like sticking their head out through the window, and you have some sense, like you're talking about, Rav Aviva, that even if I can't touch you, like I could imagine that I could touch you, as opposed to you being a 2-dimensional representation. And again, it's not clear that was ever applied to individuals who were isolated, right? Like it's one thing to say there's 6 people here, can I join 4 more people in to round up to 10, than to say there's 10 people looking out of windows in a courtyard, and one of them can say Kaddish as long as they can see the others. I haven't really seen anything that is compelling to me that that was ever entertained. So I feel like where I'm holding right now, and it goes to some degree of the resilience frame of where we are, I would sort of rather say, yeah, we may be in a period right now where there's not a lot of Kaddish. I would like to hear, Rav Aviva, if you think of it differently. But yeah, this may be a period where we're not able to do that thing. We're actually in a moment of magefa, where God's wisdom in running the world right now is that we are not saying Kaddish in collective groups. And that's sort of, I think, a paradigm we have to kind of be okay with. That said, there's enough ambiguity here and enough people, again, already reacting on Rav Melamed's psak. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to stop someone who wants to say Kaddish, says, would it be okay with the group on Zoom if I said Kaddish? I don't think it makes a lot of sense to stop that person from doing that, because there may be an argument for where that is grounding. Though I guess I would prefer, and maybe we'll get to this in a number of other questions we'll take up, a frame that enables us to be okay with the fact that there may be practices and even obligations we're just not able to fully take on at this moment. And that might sometimes be the wiser course than figuring out how everything's going to get configured to this idiosyncratic, please God, idiosyncratic situation. I don't know how that resonates with you on that last point.
Yeah, well, what I was just thinking was around this question of derech shmi'ah, right? Does talking through Zoom and being with each other through Zoom, is that the way we end up hearing each other? Is if that's going to become the way of gathering in general? And I agree that right now that feels like more of a disjuncture rather than a sort of continuity. And so that should maybe be reflected in halacha, that we don't do the things we usually do when we are able to be physically with each other. The one thing that I am thinking about, and this is it's a morbid and scary thought, but if we do reach a point where there are people who are really dying in our communities in ways where we can't do Shiva or other things, we need to rely on something like the possibility of saying Kaddish through Zoom that might feel more natural, because it will feel more like a way of being together. We'll be more conscious of that being sort of derech, the way to be together, rather than feeling like a sense of how far apart we are on the computers, right? So that's where this language of derech, I think, is so critical, not just from a kind of formal perspective, but right, do you sort of see the glass half full or half empty, right, when we're in these modes of communication? And that could really shift as this period continues. And they also wanted to just mention that Rabbi Eli Confer just gave a shiur virtually recently through one of our Hadar programs that talks about kind of alternatives to Kaddish, to say as a yachid, as an individual, and also that right, in many ways, the real way of fulfilling what Kaddish has become is to do a mitzvah that was really important to a parent, if one is saying Kaddish for a parent, and really focusing on ma'asim tovim. So Kaddish doesn't Kaddish B'tzibor doesn't have to be the only way to honor somebody's memory.
Yeah. There's so much more to say on this, and for those who just want to know, you get a sense here so far, like institutionally, to the extent that Hadar has been doing anything in terms of joint davening spaces. We've had an alumni gathering every morning. We have not been doing Dvarim Shabik Tusha or anything that requires a minyan. Like with many things, as you hear from what Rav Aviva said, we're also trying to understand where things are going on this, but that's currently the line that we've been holding. There's so much more to get to. Rav Aviva, I know something we've been talking about a lot and you've been thinking and working on a lot lately, is the question of mikvah, tevila for nida, all the consequences of that. We got some questions also with respect to giur. I'm hoping you can open us up here with some framing around this, and then we'll talk about some of the consequences.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this has been taking up a lot of my inbox and WhatsApp. And I want to sort of say a brief word on how to frame this. I think what's most troubling about the way this conversation is going in some places is the extent to which people feel a really strong tension between quote unquote fulfilling halacha and doing what is healthy and safe. Certainly all over Israel, there's been a lot of different kinds of media, Facebook and other places where that's really exploding as a question. And I find that to be kind of heartbreaking that that's the language that is being used, and that's what people are really feeling about this question, right? Should I keep halacha and go to the mikveh even though it's risking my life, or right, should I put my safety paramount? And that is something that should really never be that kind of tension. So we know that there's right in Bikuach Nefesh or Sakana, what matters most halachically is health. Obviously, there's a lot of politics that go into this, and different sort of sectors of Jewish community and who has a say with who, and in Israel, that's all really complicated. But I want to say that the thing to do halachically is what is the most safe. And to the extent that there is a clear sakana in going to the mikveh, people should not be going to the mikveh. It's not 100% clear to medical experts right now that the mikveh is a problem. There are all sorts of guidelines being put out. I was recently on a call, being 45 minutes ago, with someone who's talked with medical experts who are still using pools of water for elderly people who need to be in the pool for physical therapy, and have their standards for how to do that so that it's safe. So there's certainly medical experts right now who are saying that it is fine to use the mikveh under certain guidelines. I think what's hard about this is as more and more regions are getting into a full social distancing mode, and people are really being careful to minimize interaction as much as they can with other people, including getting groceries delivered, hoping that the people doing the deliveries are doing that in a way that's safe for them as well. But people are even minimizing any grocery store trips. To then have the mikveh be the one thing that that feels like it's a risk is really difficult. And I want to say that the frame on this has to, right, there's a lot of sort of history of sources and halacha that have really, I think, problematic outcomes in how they're used, about the history of women who have risked their life to use the mikveh. And when we think about what that question or what that framing does and the kind of pressure it puts on people who are menstruating in this moment to make this decision, I think part of what is wrong with that is this is not about taking a personal risk. This is about what will be good for the public. And so if a lot of people are using the mikveh, to the extent that we are trying to practice social distancing right now, and to the extent that medical experts aren't actually sure how this virus spreads fully, but it does seem to live on aerosols, really small particles that can be airborne for multiple hours, it's really the social distancing piece of mikveh and not necessarily the pool of water itself that is a matter of concern for many people. So I want to say, right, we have, I was listening to a little clip from Rav Herschel Schachter that I know was charged in all sorts of ways, but there was a piece of it that was really profound, talking about the Chazon Ish in World War II, talking about where there was the need to do drills to practice in case there would be an air raid bombing, and everybody had to turn off their lights to practice what to do in case of a real emergency and a siren, right? And if any one person kept their light on, then that was it. The Germans would know where the city was, and that was it. It's not like you can make a personal decision based on the level of risk you were willing to take, and kind of navigate your choice in that way. If any person did not turn off the lights, then that was it. The whole community was at risk. And so when we're thinking in the mode of pandemic, that's the frame of mind we need to be in. It's not about what personal risk an individual is willing to take. It's really about a larger picture. So I think we are in a situation right now, and things can change on a moment's notice. But right now, it seems like the messaging we're getting is that drastic measures of social distancing is sort of our best hope to not have, or at least to minimize, the level of disaster we're going to face in terms of the morbidity rate. And going to the mikveh is a safek sakana in this situation. What should happen if the pathway seems to be, we don't want a lot of people using the mikveh? I will say that, right, it's possible for some people, the pathway might be, don't go to the mikveh, and in this situation of Shad HaDechak, right, release any derabanan harchakot, right, sort of restriction on sex stays in force, but sort of physical intimacy that isn't sexual would be allowed in that circumstance. And then, God willing, there's a time where it's safe to go to the mikveh when that's safe. In some more extenuating circumstances, it might be necessary to find an alternative to mikveh. And I'm gonna let Rav Eitan, I was gonna ask you your latest thoughts on that possibility. I will say that it's something that we're seeing is the possibility of, quote unquote, avoiding being in the state of nida altogether through use of hormone pills or other interventions. And right, it's that kind of picture of, well, either halacha changes, or I disobey halacha, or I change my body. That kind of picture that feels sort of stagnant and paralyzed when it comes to the possibilities in halacha itself is what we want to be kind of presenting an alternative to. So I want to ask you, Rav Eitan, your latest thoughts on thinking about how to approach mikveh at this moment.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just put out there sort of two extremes on some level that seem like they go to completely opposite directions, but they're both an effort to do what you're talking about, Rav Aviva, which is to say, well, what does it look like to just sort of own the fullness of the reality in which I live? So one thing I want to say is I think it's important to note, and it goes with some themes we've been hitting on throughout here. Again, assuming we're talking about a limited period of time, I don't think we should disregard abstinence as a possible response. I mean, there are notions even more broadly, which is not really what our culture is used to. Lo yishamesh adam mitato b'shnot re'avon, that like in times of famine, right? Yosef yulad shnei banim b'terem tavo shnat ha'ra'av, right? It says that Yosef had 2 sons before the years of the famine came. Why do I care that it was the years before the famine came? famous Agadah, and that talks about that, well, because he didn't have sex with his wife during the years of the famine, because it would have been inappropriate for him to do so while the rest of the country was starving. And that also, there's a power element there for sure. But I do want to say, there are times where even without insane stories about, breaking through ice and going to immerse in frozen rivers and all these kinds of things, even adopting the frame of, sakana, so can't immerse. Sometimes the consequence of that is, well, actually, we can't do certain things, whether it's kaddish or even potential personal intimacy. I sort of want that on the table as a religious response that I think is coherent. And I certainly don't want to take that away from anyone for whom that actually feels like it's the right thing. They're very clear that they are not going to go to the mikveh now. And they're very clear that the result of that is that a life of intimacy will wait. Now, for all kinds of reasons, including people who are trying to conceive, people who have all sorts of other reasons why that may be emotionally unhealthy, devastating, et cetera, I want to sort of go from that extreme to the other, which is, well, yes, I do think in moments, right, in moments like this, you do sometimes bring up questions that perhaps you would have or did bring up in another time, but they never got traction. Just an analog on this, right? The most famous case I know of this is the date for when you stop asking for rain is in the, according to tradition, at the end of Pesach. And the Rosh, Rav Asher ben Yechiel, in the Middle Ages felt this was absurd in Europe because the main time that you needed rain was actually between Pesach and Shavuot, right now, right, March, April, May. And he tried for years to, argue that we should be moving the V'tein Talumatar to go all the way to Shavuot. But he only pressed his case when there was a drought and everyone was freaking out and ready to ask for rain. He didn't prevail, but that's another story. There are times where, moments of crisis make you reevaluate certain things. So here, this I would not tell you I have in some, tshuva misuderet written out and completely annotated, though it's something I've been trying to sit down and work on much more thoroughly in recent days. But, the question of what of the water sources that are in our house, indoor plumbing, are potentially valid for tevilah has been raised in the past, and I think it's something that has to be looked at again, even if the answer is not 100% simple in all contexts. To just sort of talk about that very briefly, right? The main problem classically with immersing outside of a sort of either institutional mikvah or a natural body of water was there was no way to have water that was valid for tevilah in one's house. Because the only way to do that was to fill a bucket up with water and to bring it into the house and pour it maybe into some big tub and then go into it. And that's a classic case of mayim she'uvim, water that's been drawn by human hands, has no sense of emerging from nature, from God's hand, no sense of being, either an inexhaustible amount of water or water that's been collected in a natural process. And so it can't do the work of flipping a body's state from one state to another. We haven't lived in that world for over, a century now or so, where there is now water that is pumped directly into our house in a way that actually just comes without us feeling like we're doing anything. And in a way that when we stand under it, feels like standing under a waterfall, or immersing in it feels like we're immersing in a pool. Now, the bathtub has been the locus of some of these discussions, and even Rav Chaim Amalem in Israel has tried to revive a psak of Rav Masas, who at an earlier time talked about immersing in a bathtub. The problem with a bathtub is no one normal has a bathtub that is 40 sa'ah. No one normal has a bathtub that is the amount of volume of water that can immerse the human body in it all at once in a stationary state. For water to be mitaher be'ashboren in a collected pool, it's got to be big enough to, encompass the human body and then some. So the bathtub is not a viable option. That's just sort of putting water on one part of your body and then getting it on another. The option that's been less explored, though it was taken up about 100 years ago, Hershenson, who was the rabbi in Hoboken, New Jersey, of all places, but a huge Talmid Chacham, a lot of correspondence with Rav Uziel back in the day. He basically has this long tshuva in his Responsa Malki Bakodesh, essentially arguing for the validity of a shower as a mikvah. He pulls back at the end because he's nervous about whether the water source has really been uninterrupted from its origin to the shower. But if I can just sort of lay out for you, this is my developing beyond what he said there, but it's sort of some of the basic contours. The idea is that, well, it's true, you need 40 sa'ah, you need 40 sa'ah in which to immerse the body. And you are generally not allowed to have that water be in motion. That's why mikvaot are pools, so they're stationary. But a ma'ayan, a spring, is mitaher bezochalin. It's able actually to purify things even while in motion, basically because its sort of replenishing powers, I think, are so self-evident that there's no sense of if it's in motion, it's sort of depleting and fading away. And the Mishnah on Mikvaot tells us that a yam, a sea, but a yam doesn't mean a sea or an ocean in the Mishnah. It means like a huge body of water, has the status of a ma'ayan in the sense that it can purify when in motion. I think there's a pretty solid argument that the municipal water system, starting from the reservoir and through to our pipes, has the status of a yam. That is to say, it is the volume and sort of inexhaustible character of it that it fundamentally has that status. And the pipes can be argued not to render the water drawn because they're essentially laid out to just convey it in an uninterrupted form from the source, though different places may be arranged in different ways. In New York City, there was a book written like back in the 1950s that a full analysis of the whole municipal water system and concluded, Rav Nissim Telushkin, that there was no problem of she'uva, of drawn water in the water system here. Whether that's the same, Israel, other places, requires a little bit of investigation. But the idea that basically the volume of water and its capacity to purify while in motion, combined with the fact that normally for water to be joined together, you need kishvoferet anod, you need a constant path that is the size of sort of two fingers rotated on their axis to create one joined unit. That there's an important position of Rabbi Eliezer of Verona, brought in the Beit Yosef, who says that that doesn't apply when it's a kind of unidirectional water system, where something is being kind of pumped, basically pushed in one direction, such that it's totally obvious that all the water coming out of your shower head is linked to all the water on the other side of it, which is pushing through to try to land on you. If so, I think there is some serious place for talking about a sort of full and complete immersion under the shower head as counting as tevilah. Now, this is a little oily im omar, oily im lo omar, in the sense that, the slightest changes in some of the physical realities here could potentially lead one to a different halacha conclusion. And at the same time, it feels irresponsible to me not to talk about that or put that out there, or to say that I think in a lot of cases that is, in fact, a reasonable argument that can be made, and certainly in a pressing circumstance. So there's more to say there, but I think that in response to your question, that's sort of my feeling. I think we have to be prepared to, in an integrative way, look at what I laid out there as kind of two extremes of how we potentially respond to this.
Thank you. I was just thinking as you were talking in terms of the two extremes, which are definitely quite different from each other. And I think as couples are figuring out how to navigate that, we have to remember that at this time of social distancing, the importance of physical intimacy with your partner at home could be all the more all the more critical. So that's a piece to lay on the table, where I guess what I want to say, just as a closing thought on this before we move on to thinking about Pesach, is I think we're in a situation where it can't just be the individual choice. I would like to see a sense of, in a period of social distancing, the recommendation should be not to be going to the mikveh. And even as people are going to the grocery store, and the mikveh might actually be kind of safer than a grocery store, still we don't have to make this kal vachomer from doing what you need to do for parnasa and essentials to doing a mitzvah. We see the Noda B'Yehuda talks about this when it comes to hunting. People put their lives at risk to hunt, perhaps for a livelihood, but that doesn't mean that you make leaps to other, that you therefore must put your life at risk for a mitzvah. So I think that piece needs to be clear, and then figuring out how you navigate that as a couple, what to do if you're not going to the mikveh. We've laid out a pretty wide spectrum here. Okay, I think on a lot of people's minds, maybe we can have one quick comment on, a lot of people are asking about electricity, using Zoom for Shabbat meals or for Seder. And I think this is another situation where, on the one hand, it can be so important and powerful to be with other people. And certainly if anybody's feeling like they're really in total isolation by themselves and really need that for serious mental health concerns, then obviously pikuach nefesh is critical. At the same time, I think the importance of having some time that really is like Shabbat or Yom Tov as a break from the week of Zoom and computers is also important. A lot of people are asking about how are we going to do this 3-day Yom Tov and Shabbat? What are you thinking about that, Rav Eitan?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo, I have a strong instinct on this that we should not, in other words, assuming frame of reference, I would never use Zoom on Shabbat the rest of the year. I do not think it is a great idea for us to be wading into that in this moment that I just don't think, I think we should still be working on kind of the resilience and response to this reality rather than assuming it is a complete new reality that's here to stay for years at a time. And yeah, it could be months, and it could be like you will think back, wow, those were the months where I had a lot of Shabbatot that had some degree of isolation. And again, I want to get to the health issues in a minute, but the notion of it being strange or the notion of it being difficult, that doesn't feel to me like enough to sort of reshuffle the deck here in terms of what's happening. And in the best situation, we open ourselves up to very different kinds of religious experiences. I don't think we should completely discount what we sometimes discover when we open ourselves up to that. And that's why I would prefer to address the places of need specifically through a discourse of need and vulnerability and illness and language that itself indicates something that's sort of off what we hope to be the norm. And there, I would just throw out two precedents that feel important to me here. One is a Braita in the Gemara in Eruvin, Matifin me'arak lechole b'Shabbat, which is some kind of sort of soothing musical instrument or chime, some kind of chime that was used to kind of get someone who was agitated, whose life was not at risk at all, but who was sort of mentally agitated and needed to rest, to kind of, think about someone who needs to listen to like white noise to fall asleep or something like that. And they needed that. The Gemara says you do that for that person on Shabbat, even though you normally wouldn't be engaging with an object that makes noise in a sort of an instrument in that way. So to the extent of the status of chole in a mental or other phase, sort of sense that being present with them on Zoom in a way that didn't involve, involvement with the with the controls or any kind of writing or recording would do that, that strikes me as, you know, an important precedent that recognizes you're doing something for someone in need. In other words, it's not just, this is going to make my Shabbat more meaningful. This is going to make Shabbat, you know, just more inspirational for me. But I'm otherwise going to feel like I'm actually in a vulnerable and perhaps even place, or someone else is. That's one. And the second is, look, in general, issues that relate to illness are waived on the second day of Yom Tov. The case of likholat ha'ayin, the case of it's literally applying a certain kind of eye salve to the eye, but which all the poskim make very clear is not only is there no danger to life, there's not even a choli kol haguf, there's not even an illness that's being experienced throughout the body. There's just a sense of my eye is bothering. It will make it feel a lot better if I do this thing, which isn't really a melacha, but it's not something that we do, at least on rabbinic level, on Yom Tov. On Yom Tov Sheni, on the second day of Yom Tov, that's just lifted. And I came across a pretty wacky parallel to this when in the smoking wars in the 19th century, all the poskim are trying to figure out, can you smoke on Yom Tov? The Ktav Sofer is the Chat Sofer's grandson. He says, I see a lot of people smoking on the second day of Yom Tov, but not on the first. It seems to me the only way you can justify this is the withdrawal symptoms are so severe by day 2 that they're already in some kind of, you know, state of holy, that it's just waived on the second day of Yom Tov, and, you know, you're able to do it. I do think, therefore, someone who makes a considered judgment that they have a very clear practice of not using any kind of electricity, not just on Shabbat, but also on Yom Tov. If they were in this year to make an exception for the second day of Yom Tov, would have some coherence that can be narrated very clearly through a halachic lens that would not necessarily sort of have to spill over into breaking down that wall. But it is something I think I would recommend people be very careful about, because I think, to be honest, many of these behaviors rely on us conditioning ourselves to experience them as taboos. And when you lift taboos, even for good reasons, there's often consequences. And so I think it's worthwhile thinking very, very carefully about that. I think we're going to go beyond 9 p.m. here, Rav Aviva, if people are, for people who want to stand, as Lauren is okay with that.
We could go till time to say Kriyat Shema in the morning. Yeah, so I think hearing you talk about that and the sort of the difference between, well, this will make it a more inspiring day, to right between that and, oh, there's actually some sort of vulnerability or need, right? A lot of questions about Seder and Zoom. I actually think this is sort of a perfect constellation, even if the circumstances are so dire and really undesired, to sort of look at two halachic problems and combine them and reach a beautiful solution. Right? A lot of people want to start their Seder early every year, and especially now that daylight savings time shifts. But you have different relatives, especially elderly relatives, and maybe you don't want to start at the time that you would ideally be waiting to start Seder. So I think, right, again, the question is, what are we trying to accomplish? What are the different needs here, and what are the dynamic ranges of religious experience that we can be open to and resilient to? So, right, you could think of doing an early Seder on Zoom, which is when everybody wants to start a Seder anyway. Certainly doing Magid, maybe with the kids also. You can do the Kiddush for them and Matzah for them as Chinuch, and get the kind of interaction and discussion and do all the favorite songs that you want to sing, and then do a shorter Seder after it gets dark. And I do think, right, Rav Eitan mentioned this briefly, you were saying, what's our resilience? What religious experiences are we open to, even in a moment that is so hard? Right? It could be that, you know, the Mishnah knows, the Mishnah can imagine a Seder where you're by yourself. that is within the realm of possibility of the religious experience in the Mishnah. And it could be hard and it could be sad. And there's certainly a lot of resources people are putting out there. But I think the jump to, well, let's just try to make it as normal as possible in a moment where things are not normal, or sort of would push for a little more creativity to think of the different possibilities there. Obviously using electricity on Yom Tov, different than using electricity on Shabbat, though again, the sort of typing in words is more than just using electricity. So I think a lot of people are jumping to the Zoom Seder model. I'm sure people will feel a lot of familiar pressure to make certain choices. And I want to, sort of the goal here is to open up a couple different pathways to, again, sort of allow something to continue to be a taboo, to have a Seder. Remember, we started talking about the tefillah on Zoom and how if tefillah is about sort of being able to remove any other thoughts and just be able to focus on your tefillah, and how that computer screen there can draw you to it. And it's very different to be with people doing something together than to be staring at people on a screen. And so in some ways it might be that we just have to acknowledge a bit of loss on the Seder is not going to be like the normal Seder. And then how can we try to tap into the different aspects of it that we're looking for?
Yeah, where should we go from here?
Well, I think a lot of people are really freaking out about how to get ready for Pesach in these moments. So maybe we can talk about how to clean for Pesach.
Okay, great. So yeah, let's talk about some basic stuff here. Let me say something very clear about selling chametz and stockpiling chametz. Normally, I'm not a chametz seller. I'm not for it. It's something that starts off as a leniency when people are stuck literally on a boat in the original case. Get some traction, financial loss, people running distilleries, and using it as an end run around Tashbitu Sa'or Mibatechem, the actual mitzvah to fulfill of getting everything out, has never seemed like a great idea to me. But you know, it's real and it's legitimate, and certainly if you sell your chametz, you've completely fulfilled the obligation not to eat chametz. A few people asked about, you know, okay, but what if this year I really need to have it around? So just a couple of clarifying things, and then yes, an acknowledgement that this year is different. All indications so far that there's no disruption in the food supply. There's no real reason to stock up in general. Most important, there's no problem with owning kitniot on Pesach. Those are some of the main staples you would stockpile anyway: rice, beans, lentils, all those sorts of things. So even if one were going to stockpile, I would say do that as opposed to pasta. And in that sense, I haven't yet seen a reason why structurally, writ large, we're really in a place where we need to be more lenient than in other years. That said, if you have a hint of a feeling that you are putting yourselves in jeopardy by not having some chametz foods on hand, then for sure, this is a year to rely on selling, even if you otherwise don't. People asked about kitniot, you know, eating them on Pesach, you know, there too, it's really just a matter, as it always is, of how solid your ancestral practice is, and questions of health. You know, the Mishnah Brura rules outright that a choleh, someone who just doesn't feel great in terms of having unbalanced nutrition, should eat kitniot. So sure, to the extent that you determine that you could better stay at home and stay healthy by eating kitniot, that would be a potential justification. It's worth thinking whether some of this can be solved by some online ordering. I saw people talking about, you know, what if I can't get grape juice? Because right before the call, it was like I Googled Amazon. There's lots of grape juice, like kosher grape juice for sale. I do think there's a number of these anxieties that with one targeted delivery of a number of key things can happen. And I think it is sort of important to kind of remember that, you know, what you basically need for Pesach is some matzah, 4 cups of wine, let's say for both nights. And that's kind of it. Like ideally you'd have a romaine lettuce for maror. You don't need a shank bone if you can't get a shank bone. There were plenty of Amoraim that just had other dishes on their Seder plate. You certainly don't need gefilte fish. I mean, that's hard to imagine. But if we're talking about the actual staples, you know, it actually can be done in a very targeted way. Just one other thing on ingredients. You know, flour. The Shulchan Aruch says in a pinch you can make matzah out of kemach min hashuk, flour that just is that you buy regularly and assume it hasn't gotten wet. Mishnah Berurah weighs in there, and this is certainly true, that is no longer true in our reality, that our kemach min hashuk, our flour that's bought generally, it's most likely chametz in the sense that it's actively treated with water all along the way at various points, steaming and other processes, but certainly is not appropriate to make matzah with, which means either got to get matzah, or, you know, again, you're completely unable to get matzah, so then you're exempt from matzah. But again, I think there's some pretty straightforward, at least mail order delivery things that can help here. I'll maybe say a few things about just the cleaning and keeping that under control, and then Rabbi Aviva, you can fill in some other things.
Yeah, I kind of want to just pause you here for a second as we're launching into all the details of Pesach, and I know there's people who are like, I've never done Pesach myself before. I always go to my parents. I don't know how to clean. I don't know how to cook. Can you maybe just say a word before getting into more of the specifics on how to think about Pesach in this time period?
Yeah, meaning, we'll just say another sentence, meaning how to think about it, how?
I mean, I guess I think a lot of people have a flurry of questions about Pesach, and it's like you can feel the anxiety in just between the little black and white letters on the screen. I think in some ways just launching into all the details of it reinforces that sense of freak out. And certainly Pesach is an intense holiday and there's a lot of prep, but I think what we're hearing when you say something like, well, actually all you need for the Seder is those 4 cups of wine and that matzah, and you don't need your 5-course meal. Right, in some ways, I think just prepping for Pesach doesn't need to add a lot of anxiety in our lives at this moment. And
yeah, so let me just double down on that really strongly. I mean, it's Zman Cherutenu. It is the time of our liberation, and a sense that we are really celebrating an incredible moment. I have always been, for what it's worth, so take what I say with a grain of salt. I am a Pesach lover. Our people divides into the Pesach lovers and the Pesach haters. I'm a Pesach lover, which includes, like, I kosher everything every year. Even when I'm not home, I get roped into koshering my sister-in-law's house. So I have the street cred on this. But yeah, people, I don't want to say people go overboard, because I think that can actually disrespect the energy that people actually want to and find meaning investing in it. I want to take that away from anyone, including this year. But to the extent that you are feeling oppressed by various elements of it, it just doesn't actually have to be that way. Let's remember, the ban on owning chametz applies to things that are larger than a kazait, things that are larger than an olive. That means you do not actually need to rid your house of every crumb. You need to rid your house of pieces of bread or boxes of pasta that have gotten lost and things of that sort. And in that sense, depending on how big your house is, it really doesn't take more than a couple hours to fulfill the basic obligation of cleaning your house for Pesach when you're talking about just getting rid of stuff. Now, koshering, if you're going to kosher stuff and turn things over and want to use it for food, so then, yeah, that requires a little more work. There are some great guides online. Here I'm chatting over the CRC. I think has a pretty good, thorough, and pretty reasonable guide on this front. Hadar has put out various things in past years, you can find a lot of that guidance. You know, even there, I'd say it's to kosher your kitchen is like you really can do it in half a day. You certainly could do it in a full day. If we're talking just a basic thing of you're running the oven on the highest temperature for an hour, you're running all the burners on the highest temperature for 15 minutes, you're boiling water and pouring it over the surfaces you're going to use for prep, and otherwise covering other surfaces where you're not going to, you're not going to get in, you're not going to cook, but you may have food there. That doesn't have to be onerous. Obviously, if you've got Pesach stuff, you're schlepping up and down. Okay, so you know what that's like. That's not really different this year than any other year, and staying at home is not really an impediment to that. I think where people have a little more anxiety is around the shopping and what can they buy and what do they need to worry about. So there, maybe I'll just highlight two things that I think are most relevant. One is for staying at home, and one is for folks who are stuck in places, or stuck is maybe too harsh a word, but you find yourself in an environment that you wouldn't normally on Pesach, where other people are eating chametz, right? And they're not cleaning everything out. So just in terms of being at home, yeah, the general rule, and certainly it's the standard rule in the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah before you get to various traditions of leniency, of stringency, is that pure products that have been purchased before Pesach, where any chametz that might have gotten into them would be less than 1/60th of the total, are fine to use on Pesach. So that means that like cottage cheese, cream cheese, butter, milk, orange juice, spices that are finely ground where you can just see like there's nothing in there, and if there is some speck, it is totally mixed in with everything else. Those are all the kinds of products where even if you normally buy them only with a hechsher for Pesach, this is a year where you should totally feel comfortable relying on that notion of bitul b'shishim, nullification at a 1/60th ratio prior to Pesach. The idea is you acquire it before Pesach. It is nullified before Pesach when there's nothing forbidden. It does not reawaken when Pesach comes, even though if a small speck of chametz were to fall into something on Pesach, you would treat it as forbidden. So that's piece number one, which can give people hopefully some sense of, yeah, if you're panicked, what am I going to do if the kosher store runs out of things? Well, at the end of the day, there's vegetables, there's fruits, there's plenty of pure products, which are fundamentally fine to own on Pesach. If you want to, if you want a little more rabbinic backup on this, you can find the Abadi's Pesach guide, which they always put out online. They have added leniencies for Sfaradim, but most of what they do is also totally valid for Ashkenazim as well, and that can give you a sense of what to do there. On the one, we got a whole slew of questions about people, as I said, away from their normal preferred sort of Pesach compliant environment. How do you deal there? So there you really, I would say, need to do two things, all right? It is a real concern, right? That is to say, being in proximity to chametz on Pesach is not a simple thing. And Pesach, and chametz on Pesach is oser b'mashu, like it forbids an infinitesimal amount, and that would still be the case. So you need to do two things. Number one, you got to keep things separate. Like people ask me, is it possible, to sort of have one burner on a stove that I've koshered and the other burners are being used for something else? So if you're really keeping things separate, that is theoretically possible. You have to be very careful about that, right? You'll have to make sure that you're not going to be cooking something next to someone on an adjacent burner who's cooking a pot of pasta, and a little bit can jump out and fall into your pot. So it would be like not cooking things at the same time, keeping things wiped down and clean, all of those things. But then, yeah, a dry burner next to a dry burner is not going to forbid the other side. If you're talking about ovens and things like that, yeah, an oven that someone's baking bread in right before, you're going to basically need to re-kosher that oven if you're going to use it again. And that's where, indeed, it will be difficult. You'll have to do some degree of negotiating with roommates, some degree of timing, and maybe you'll have some things where it's just actually difficult for you to use the oven or other appliances. Or maybe there's an appliance that can be koshered and one that can be left a different way. I'm happy to provide guidance one-on-one if people need anything. So that's sort of number one. Yes, you can do it. You can have a part of the refrigerator that's cordoned off with its own little surface paper that you lay down, make it clear that everything is kept separate, and just keep it separate. The second thing, which is a leniency that Ashkenazim don't traditionally normally rely on, but they are, even Ashkenazim are authorized to rely on it in places of loss, is the notion of noten tam lifgam being mutar bepesach. So what's that principle? The principle is that the rest of the year, when a forbidden food contributes a negative flavor to a permitted food, then it doesn't matter if it's more than a 60th, okay? It could be a 10th of the entire volume, and you totally taste it, but the flavor that mixed in is bad. It's ruined it. So if you think, for instance, I don't know, if there was like a forbidden fish flavor that got into a cinnamon bun, okay? That's a horrible combination. It doesn't matter that you can taste the squid in your cinnamon bun. The cinnamon bun remains permitted. That's just a regular rule of kashrut. General default Ashkenazi practice has been to say that leniency doesn't apply on Pesach. Meaning if chametz contributes a negative flavor to food, it's still forbidden because chametz forbids in an infinitesimal amount on Pesach. The Maber of Yosef Karo on the Shulchan Aruch says it's totally fine. It's the same rules as the rest of the year. All right, why does this matter? This matters because under the rubric of noten tam lifgam, of forbidden flavor, also falls the impact of a pot that hasn't been used for 24 hours, okay? Which is to say, this is why standard Ashkenazi practice is that you can't kosher pots with boiling water on Pesach. Why? Because the way we normally kosher pots with boiling water is we let them sit for 24 hours, such that anything that comes out of them when we're purging them is considered to be a damaging and negative flavor, and then we don't worry about it being reabsorbed, all right? And therefore, everything is fine. On Pesach, if you hold that noten tam lifgam is asur, that kind of flavor or secretion is forbidden, so then you can't rely on that. There's no way to kosher the pot through water, whereas Sfardim kosher pots with water on Pesach. However, the Mishnah Berurah comes along and says explicitly, in cases of loss, if you are lenient with noten tam lifgam on Pesach, it's okay. So I, for many years, have given this as guidance to people who are going home to what are sometimes religiously impossible situations on Pesach. And what they are able to negotiate is a clear, you'll forgive the term, quarantining of their food, of their Pesach food from anything else chametz that's going on in the house. What they're not able to guarantee or to really accomplish is koshering the kelim, the utensils in the kitchen. And there, I think, when you are in a situation out of your control, away from home, situation we can classify as b'diavad, as basically being the real world, non-ideal situation, one can rely on taking those pots, making sure they've sat for 24 hours unused, and then even using them on Pesach. So that is the sort of two-barreled guidance I would give on that. Keep the ingredients hyper separate. Be very, very careful about that. And that's where you sort of draw the lines and negotiate your need for space and religious integrity. And to the extent that there's no way to navigate space without relying on unkoshered pots. Make sure they have been left unused for 24 hours, and you have good halachic basis on which to rely. Rabbi Aviva, what else do you think people are anxious about here that we can help them before we let them go to their anxiety?
Yeah, well, I was thinking some people have had to leave apartments in the past week without having a chance to do a bedika, which usually you would do if you're leaving within 30 days of Pesach. So to the extent that you have somebody there who could do a bedika for you, appoint somebody to be your shaliach, that would be a good way to go. If nobody is there to be a shaliach, could sell that chametz, and when you do your bitul on Erev Pesach, Kol Chamira, you can have that in mind as well. But I know that dislocation is something that some folks were worried about. I also wanted to say there was some chat windows open on this. If you, the Shulchan Aruch actually talks about what you do at a Seder if you don't have wine, or if you only have a kazayit of matzah, and it's, you know, it's not your usual, but all those cases do exist. So I might just reply specifically. I don't know if anybody will be in a situation where you have only one piece of matzah and can only use a kazayit at the Seder, but there are ways to approach those situations.
Yeah, what do you think? Just quickly, people raised various things about calendrical modifications, whether it's we should be intercalating the year, or we should be doing Pesach Sheni.
Yeah, the Pesach Sheni idea, I think it's really interesting. I think it might make sense to do something on Pesach Sheni, but in terms of actually kind of halachically a way to fulfill the Seder, that strikes me as a little bit, it's sort of high on the creativity, but certainly low on any precedent. And I don't know that it will fulfill exactly what people are hoping for, but it's possible when we get to Pesach Sheni, people want to do something if we are able to have more mobility then.
Yeah, I think that sounds right to me, which is it might be a meaningful time to do something meaningful, but I think we're also really trying to strike a chord here of, you can do this, we can do this. You know, I'll say one of my most memorable Sidarim, and granted, this is not being alone, so I understand being alone, actual alone, is a totally different thing. But I remember when I was 13, I got the chicken pox. I had somehow evaded it until then. I had a horrible case. And I couldn't go out, and we actually had to be quarantined from my grandfather. We're not sure I'd ever had it. And I was home alone with my father. It was just the two of us while everyone else went out. It was an incredibly memorable Seder. Again, that obviously had a parent-child dimension, which is very different from being alone. But I remember thinking it was going to be the worst ever. And it still is something I remember. And other times, there was one time I was totally alone for Rosh Hashanah doing a high holiday job, and I was just alone in a dark apartment eating a can of cold baked beans and learning Mishnah by myself. And I both think of it to this day as like the most miserable Rosh Hashanah ever. And I will never forget it. Like, I learned things about myself and connecting to Yom Tov, and you know, as someone who doesn't meditate regularly, it was like that kind of experience. And for those who do that more regularly, you know what sometimes having that can be meaningful for. So yeah, we don't want to presume that we have the answers or the right guidance for everyone here. I think we're just trying to provide some energy of, we think we have more resilience in us right now than perhaps some of the larger culture is acknowledging at every moment. And then we want people to really be aware of the halachic pieces here that you may not be aware of that are important. Maybe I'll just say a word about Ta'anit Bechorot. I don't know if you want.
Can I just follow up on that one? So just to be sure it's sort of loud and clear. By the time we get to Pesach, some people could be in a state of being actually alone for many weeks at that point. And I just hope that you're sort of, if you're in that situation, you're hearing us loud and clear, that, you know, if the sort of only thing that is getting you through the day is Zoom and having that, or, you know, whatever mode it is that allows you to have interaction with other people, then by all means, right, Pesach or Shabbat should not risk your mental health in a major way. So to be clear that I think a lot of people are in very different situations in terms of how this is impacting your lives.
100%. 100%. A couple people asked Ta'anit Bechorot. There too, I would say fasting as a firstborn on the day before Pesach. So it's a medieval tradition, some roots in the classical Talmudic period. It was since the 16th century. It's already been routinely undone by people attending a siyum, some kind of learning project that you finish. And there I would just say, there too I feel a combination of, look, I don't think the whole way that the siyum overrides the fast is someone who's completed learning invites you to share a seudat mitzvah with him, invites you to share a meal. And basically their invitation to something with that kind of positive religious valence forces you to eat and thereby break the fast. You can't do that over Zoom. And so I don't think it makes any sense to call into a siyum and thereby release your obligation. And therefore, you basically should do, one of three things. One is take on a learning project between now and Pesach and make your own siyum. Rav Moshe Feinstein says that studying a book of Tanakh, in significant depth, a book of Tanakh with Rashi that may be doable for some people here, totally qualifies, as something that can trigger a siyum. Or fast, right? That is to say, you could fast. You could just say, I'm going to fast on Erev Pesach, or acknowledge, as the Mishnah Brura already does in any year, but which you could argue this year all the more so, just says, someone who feels that fasting on Erev Pesach is going to screw up their ability to fulfill the mitzvot of the Seder shouldn't fast. And just acknowledge this may not be a year where you're able to do it, because actually you were never able to do it. You just normally get to a siyum, so you're not thinking about being exempt from the fast. But the reason you go to a siyum might be because you sort of know there's no way you're going to get through fasting on that day. That's a place where, personally, I would rather us be either motivated to learn, try out the experience of fasting, or acknowledge our exemption, then create something that feels like it just distorts the actual experience of sharing in someone's seudah with them and really sharing that joy.
There's a question that came in here on the chat about Mila, the permissibility of Mila, which I mostly don't really feel like an expert enough to speak to that, but I do want to say my sort of knee-jerk reaction to Mila versus mikvah is very different, and I've been trying to kind of formulate why that might be, where I think feel very strongly when it comes to mikvah that the messaging during a period of social distancing in order to lower our curve of this pandemic is that mikvah is not something that people should be doing to increase sakana in that way. Well, I think when it comes to Mila, part of what can make Mila different is you have, your moel, and as an expert, I think it could be possible to do that in a more sterile environment where, depending on availability of all sorts of equipment like masks and stuff like that, right? You could maybe imagine procedures that are easier to put in place when you have the moel who is in charge of all that, unlike the mikvah where you have multiple women coming to the same place. And right, there's a concern of being naked in that space and exposure and all of that. So I don't know. I don't have a strong formulation on that. And I assume as this goes on, we'll really have to think it through more. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would just add, we got a couple incoming on this. I would say definitely the mohalim are, obviously they're biased. These are people who devote their life to this mitzvah. But I also think there's an element of expertise there that we do have to defer to and trust to some degree. What I would just add is, in a very practical sense, this is almost responding like b'diavad, what are the consequences? Like right now my sense is that can be controlled. There's been no sense that cannot be done in a safe way, and I don't see a reason to treat it otherwise right now. To the extent someone was going to treat it otherwise, right? One of the questions that has come up a couple times is, well, should I just have the doctor do it in the hospital under the presumption that that's a more controlled environment, but that's going to be on day one, and then what happens? So again, I would not recommend that. That's not the directive I would give. What I can say is, if one does that, well then yes, what has to happen later is hatafat dam brit, which is overall not a big deal. It's just, a small drop of blood, and certainly if done when the child is still very small, there won't even be a memory of it, but it's something that's done on adults all the time, and is, while meaningful and significant, not anything that is sort of overwhelming. Obviously, to delay any kind of circumcision at all, and then imagine that one will return to do it under general anesthesia later, that's a much more significant decision. And while that feels like an unfair halachic choice to be given, if you don't think that there's an actual sakana to doing the mila, I guess I will just note that your chances of having that child be fully circumcised will probably go down if you indefinitely postpone it, as opposed to potentially unnecessarily move it up. But I don't want that to be heard as I recommend people do that. I just want people to understand what the consequences are. Of course, an uncircumcised Jew is still a Jew. And this is not fundamentally something that determines one's Jewish status or not, though it was something, of course, that barred someone from eating the Korban Pesach, and in that sense, since then, has been a very central marker of belonging in the bodily covenant. So that's the question of how to deal with it. Again, people are going to deal with a lot of these questions in very different ways. I think the Brit Milah one is probably the most extreme version of that. And the instincts run strong on that. Our goal here has been to just sort of provide some sense of some of our instincts, some of our direction, and some of what you may not have thought about or considered. I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you to Rav Aviva. Pleasure as always to talk Torah with you, and we'll hope to see everyone here at future times, maybe future chats. There may be more of these in the future. If you want a regular halachic press conference, you can, I don't know, shoot a bunch of thumbs up.
I also want to say thank you to everyone, and I think what's particularly hard in this moment is, we don't know if any of these questions are the questions that we'll all have in another week or two. But thank you all for joining.
Have a great night. Chag Sameach.